Hey, seventh grade. So today we're going to continue on with our phospholipids and our cell membrane structure. So yesterday we were talking about the structure of phospholipids. It has this glycerol head and then these two fatty acid tails. Well, we talked also about how the cell membrane is composed of these phospholipids, and they kind of go around in, I'm not going to draw the whole thing out just so that it doesn't waste up too much of your time on this video, but it kind of goes around in this bilayer structure where the fatty acid tails are between the two glycerol heads. And I'm just going to finish drawing it. And basically, and if you could kind of imagine that this is kind of just going all around, I'm just not fully drawing it out. So just to kind of complete this whole idea, this whole lesson of the cell membrane structure. So the cell membrane, we know that the phospholipids, the interior part of this bilayer is where the fatty acids reside, right? They are there and they don't like water. They are hydrophobic, and that's why they kind of design themselves to be in this bilayer. Well, what happens is that things have to go in and out of the cell, right? There's movement between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. Well, what happens is that between different portions of the cell membrane, there are going to be these things called protein channels or protein gates. So like, let's say over here, there's going to be kind of like a tunnel made out of protein that different stuff can go inside. Now, certain things can pass right through the phospholipids, like oxygen, carbon dioxide, right? So oxygen needs to go in, so it'll go in. CO2 needs to go out, so it will go out through the bilayer of these phospholipids, because the phospholipids will be fine with it going in and out. But remember when we were talking about glucose, right? Glucose needs to have the insulin to go with it so that it can attach, right, to the insulin and then go through the gate. Well, what is the gate made out of? Well, these gates are generally made out of proteins, right? These protein channels or these protein gates that allow for things to come inside and outside of the cell. And so that's how things will kind of travel. And there are many different ways that it can travel, that it transports. We're not going to get too much into it. We just are really going to just talk about the actual structure of it. So these structures, and by the way, they're found all throughout. So you can have one there. Let's say we have another one here. This is also part of the cell membrane. We'll have them over here and over there. So there are various different ones. There are receptor proteins. So like you may have like a receptor, so like a ball, like a spike, something out like that, which is a receptor, which means that they'll be able to determine what's going on outside of the cell, kind of like if you think about it, like how do we know what's going on in our outside environment? Well, we have our eyes, we have our ears, right? Our skin, we can feel things, right? So how does that happen? Well, that happens through receptors. And so the cell is also going to have its own receptors, and the receptors that they have are these proteins, right? They're like these little spikes that come out and they're able to detect what's going on outside of the cell. And then the last thing that we talked about, and we've talked about this before, are these glucose, these carbohydrate chains, that are on the outside. I'm just going to kind of draw them like this, because we know carbohydrates have these these structures. And so this carbohydrate chain is going to be on the outside of the cell, and that's going to be for cell identity, right? Cell identity, and that's going to be made of specifically of sugar. So these different structures, so we talk about these different nutrients, right? These three nutrients, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, right? All three of these things in essence make up our cell membrane. So they're all important for the cell membrane. They're all involved in the structure of the cell membrane. The one that we talk about the most are these phospholipids, right? Because the phospholipids are really surrounding the entire cell, whereas proteins are kind of scattered around. The carbohydrates are, they're there, but they're, it's not the primary part of the cell membrane. The primary part would be the phospholipids, but just know that there are other things involved in that cell membrane too, right? It's a very dynamic structure. There's a lot of different parts to it, which it's not like, simple, right? There's lots of different things that are happening, and which is pretty amazing, right? Because again, the cell membrane is the barrier that will determine what goes inside and outside of the cell. That's the first line of defense. And we're gonna talk about the cell more often, and then I'd like to, if we can, do a Zoom and watch a documentary on how a virus actually takes over the cell, which is so pertinent to what we're dealing with in this world right now, right? We're dealing with viruses and viruses attacking our cells and how they get in and how they infect us. Well, that's what's so important in the mechanism which actually helps the first line of defense, which helps the virus not get into our cells, are these cell membranes. By having this identity chain, by having these proteins that only allow certain things in, by having the phospholipids that kind of guard what comes in and out as well. So there's a lot of factors that actually help in protecting our cells. And there's many other things once the virus gets into the cell as well, many different things that can prevent it from actually taking over the cell. Okay, so this is basically the structure of the cell. I'm going to post a picture of it on Google Classroom so that you can have a little bit more of an idea of it. Okay, so then after we discuss phospholipids, we're going to talk about fats and oils. Fats and oils. So this is also part of lipids, right? So we're discussing this idea of lipids, and we know that this is made out of triglycerides. By the way, triglycerides. What word is in that word triglycerides? Glycerol, right? We know that the glycerol head is one of the parts of the phospholipids, right? Well, it's also the parts of these fats and oils that we're going to talk about today, right? What we have is this structure. It's really fascinating, really cool structure that we have is this glycerol head, okay? And then attached to the glycerol head are these 3 fatty acid tails. So the difference between phospholipids and other lipids is the other lipids, these triglycerides, have these 3 fatty acid tails attached to the glycerol head, whereas the phospholipids have 2 fatty acid tails attached to the glycerol head. Okay, so that's one of the unique differences. There are other differences too, where the phospholipid has phosphorus inside of its compound, whereas triglycerides don't. There's no phosphorus here, and that's why it's actually called a phospholipid, because of the phosphorus, and it gives it its unique structure and identity. Okay, so when we talk about the difference between fats and oils, and you've heard this before, right? We have fats and we have oils, and they would basically, you would think that they go under the same category, but they do go into the same category. They are both lipids, but they're slightly different. So let's talk a little bit about this structure itself, okay? So we have this glycerol head and then these 3 fatty acid tails. But what exactly makes up the fatty acid tail? This is where it's where the difference between a fat and an oil will come into play. So glycerol head, okay? And then we have this fatty acid tail. What is fatty acid tails made out of? They're actually made up of a chain of carbons. It's really pretty fascinating. They're actually called hydrocarbons. They're actually called hydrocarbons is because we have this carbon structure, okay? But along with this carbon structure, we know that carbon has to have 4 bonds, right? So anytime you have a carbon, right, let's just draw it out real quickly. Carbon is the atomic number 6, so 6 protons, 2 in the first shell. Then we have 4 more left, so we have 4 in the second shell. And so this is going to want to bond 4 times. Right, and that's how this is this carbon structure that is going to be able to make these really fascinating, really long chains because they're able to bond in so many different directions, and they can really form these really incredible chains called organic compounds, right? Organic compounds known as carbon compounds, okay? I think we discussed that before. It may have been 6th grade. If not, then just let me know on a Zoom. Well, we know that carbon has to make 4 bonds. Otherwise, it's not happy, it's not stable. Well, if you look over here, this carbon has 2. This carbon has 2. This carbon has 2. These lines indicate that they're bonding to something. This carbon down here only has 1, right? These carbons, if you look at this structure, right? Hopefully it's clear with this green. Maybe it's too light in here. Cover up the, I think on the camera you could see it. I think that there might be a little glare. So let me know if it's not so clear. You know what, let me draw this in black so that you can see it a little clearer. So we have these carbons, and if you notice that every carbon is attached, well, the ones in the beginning are attached to the glycerol head, but every carbon is attached to another carbon, right? And that's how we get this long chain of carbons. Well, these carbons are going to be attached to something else as well. And they're going to be attached to hydrogens. This is very light. Let's do it with blue. So this carbon is going to be attached to this hydrogen. And this is going to be attached to the hydrogen. Now, normally we don't draw out the hydrogens because if you notice, as I'm drawing it, there's lots of different hydrogens. Okay? Now, this bottom one, again, there's nothing underneath it that's not connecting to another carbon down here. So what do I have to do? I am going to attach a hydrogen down here as well. So this last carbon actually is attached to 3 hydrogens, where the other ones are all attached to 2 hydrogens. And we're going to go to this one as well. So hydrogen, 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 hydrogen. Okay, we're just going to keep attaching these different hydrogens. And you want to make sure that each of the carbon is bonded 4 times. Okay, once you get to a point where it's just like a lot, we're almost done. There you go. So we end up having this long chain structure, this structure that has carbon, 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 hydrogen, 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 right? These hydrocarbons, these are called hydrocarbons. And they're hydrocarbons because they're made up of hydrogen and carbon. That's what it's made out of, right? And so we have these long, and they can go on for really long time, right? Phospholipids, by the way, their fatty acid tails are also made up of hydrocarbons, okay? And by the way, hydrocarbons are hydrophobic, right? They actually don't like water. That's the part that doesn't like the water, okay? And it has to do with the positive and the negative charges, and the polarity of water and what's going on here. But we're not going to get too much into that. So these hydrocarbons, right, you see that there's long, long chains, but everything right here, everyone is satisfied, okay? So right now, I'm not going to talk too much about fats and oil today. We're going to go into that tomorrow. But right now, just know that this is our basic structure of a triglyceride. All right, so that's going to be that for today. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you tomorrow.